Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Yes? Awesome. My name is Arati Maleku, Assistant Professor at the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University, and also an early career director on the SWR board. On behalf of the SWR Board of Directors, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone who are joining us in person and virtually to our invited symposium entitled From Exclusion to Inclusion, Unerasing Asian Identities and Dismantling Systemic Racism Through Praxis. At this defining moment in history, when our nation is undergoing a racial reckoning, we all agree that social work must lead the charge to speak out against hatred, discrimination, othering, and unjust systems that create hierarchies among Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Though acts of discrimination and othering against Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi American APIDA people have increased in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the history of racist and xenophobic attitudes towards APIDA communities are often absent in the present-day discourse on race relations in the United States. The model minority myth has systematically perpetuated APIDA labor exploitation, both economic and intellectual, to uphold racial injustice, deprive political representation, and protect white supremacy. It's crucial to note that APIDAs are a diverse conglomeration of over 30 distinct ethnic groups that speak over 100 different languages with different historical and contemporary migration experiences. And these broader, both historical and migrational contexts, point to the many forms of structural racism and violence that continue to shape the everyday lives of APIDAs in the United States. In March 2021, shortly after the March 16th Georgia attacks, SWR co-led the effort with other social work leadership organizations and APIDA groups across the United States to release a joint statement on social work's call to action against pandemic othering and anti-Asian racism, condemning the alarming rise in discrimination, oppression, harassment, violence, and racism perpetuated against APIDA people in the wake of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and really calling social workers to disrupt all forms of anti-Asian racism and continually work towards creating hope and healing spaces across APIDA communities, US societies, and around the globe. If you have not had a chance to read the joint statement, I'd encourage everyone to read this collective call to action, which is still available on the SWR website. Following the joint statement and the collective call to action, we are continuing this important conversation today to engage social work researchers and educators toward a robust understanding of this critical issue facing APIDA communities in line with our conference theme, Social Work Science for Racial, Social, and Political Justice, that is focusing on the intersecting areas of racial, social, and political justice as underlying values that have long driven the social work profession and our commitment to upholding these principles in our current reality. Before I introduce our panelist and our moderator today, I'd like to mention that the questions we will be discussing have been curated using a crowdsourcing model where members of the APIDA community had a chance to contribute their questions and provide their inputs. Because many questions were collected, we have done our best to summarize the questions and include core themes of visibility, diversity, and policy action. That's going to guide our conversation today. So my sincere thanks to members of the APIDA community, the entire social work community, and the SWR board for continual engagement in this critical issue. We have a great group of panelists who are joining us virtually today. Our panelists are Dr. Cindy Sangalang, who is an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles in the departments of Social Welfare and Asian American Studies. Dr. Sangalang's research aims to address mental health issues and inequities facing migrant communities and communities of color, particularly Asian Americans. We have Dr. Gautam Yadama, who is professor and the dean of Boston College School of Social Work. Dean Yadama's research is focused on understanding poverty and environmental dynamics and interventions to address the attendant social, economic, environment, and health outcomes. We have Dr. Hyuk Chris Ham, who is a professor at Boston University School of Social Work. Her research is dedicated to reducing health disparities among Asian American populations with a particular emphasis on building empirical evidence on health risk behaviors. Next, we have Dr. Hyo-Jin Im, Associate Professor at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Social Work. Dr. Im is interested in promoting mental health and psychosocial support for refugee and immigrant communities by building community capacity and partnership for culturally responsive services and trauma-informed care. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Keith Chan, who is an assistant professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College. Dr. Chan's research interest focuses on social determinants of health among Asian Americans, older adults, mental health, disability, substance use, and population health. Our session today will be moderated by Dr. Peter Szto. Dr. Peter Szto is a professor at the Grace Abbott School of Social Work, University of Nebraska at Omaha. His research focuses on ethnic diversity, visualizing social welfare, and mental health stigma. Before we begin our session, I'd like to make a land and labor acknowledgement. We honor and express our gratitude to indigenous peoples from more than 575 tribes and pueblos who are first peoples and traditional stewards of these lands on which we live, teach, research, and practice social work. We also recognize the ties between higher education and the North Atlantic slave trade. Profits from slavery helped found and shape college and university campuses, and enslaved Africans built and served in these institutions. We also hold sacred the labor of immigrants, often exploited, indentured, and underpaid, that built and continue to serve our institutions. We honor the labor and resistance of these ancestors, acknowledge that we benefit from this land and labor, and strive to work towards liberation for all. And with that, I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Peter Szto to start our panel.
Welcome again, everybody. I want to know that I'm very nervous because I've never done something like this before. So bear with us all as we learn together. Are the panelists going to be up here? So I'd like to start off with some instructions. So I'm going to go through 3 questions for the panelists, and they were all given them beforehand. I'm going to read them here so that you could also understand what their thinking is and what their response is. So the first question has a little context. I'm just going to look at that. And the ongoing pandemic has brought to light the racism that APIDA communities face in this current moment. However, we know that this contemporary violence is tied to a long history of anti-Asian racism in the US that reflects processes that have served to exclude, dominate, scapegoat, erase, homogenize, and make the identities and experience of APIDA communities invisible. We know that the racialized stereotypes placed on us as model minorities, as perpetual foreigners, as disease carriers, are not new, but constitute a history of violence that is centuries old and part of a broader community of white supremacy that affects not just APIDA communities, but other minoritized, racialized groups. So my first question to the esteemed panelists is, given our present-day discourse on race relations in the United States, where APIDAs are often excluded, how can we approach conversations around visibility and representation of our community? And I'll ask someone to chime in, or I will pick somebody. Okay. Can I ask Dr. Chan to share some of your thoughts on that question about conversations around visibility and representation in our community?
Sure, yes. And I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to come and speak with this esteemed panel. This is a very important topic and one that I think is very important in the context of Asian American representation, but also how we approach this issue of social workers. Over the course of the past year, we've seen that the representation of Asian identities have really come to the fore. And much of this was driven by APIDA communities who've become more powerful in different spaces. Sadly, it was also driven by the very kind of in-your-face, overt anti-Asian racism and violence. Just now, I learned that an Asian woman was pushed onto the subway tracks in New York City this morning, and she died. And this happened in New York City. We have not seen this kind of spotlight on Asian identities since the murder of Vincent Chin in the early 1980s, but spotlights are also inherently fickle and can fade very quickly. It may seem self-evident that we stay visible by maintaining our visibility. Asian Americans are primarily an immigrant population, and immigrants have a lot to lose because this is a facet of an identity that can put us at risk. So a lot of it is really up to those of us who have a safe platform to speak out for others and to advocate for representation in our communities. I would also add, though, that there are different degrees that one can take based on different situations, sometimes making it clear that we want representation and that we cannot abide by a position of acquiescing who we are may be enough. Other times, it is making sure that we are inclusive of Asian identities that don't easily fit into the mold, such as those who are still struggling with poverty or mental health issues. So finding ways to complement the strength of differences in our communities may be the most important thing that we can do for the purposes of representation and for each other. And with that, I would actually like to yield back and hear what many of our other panelists would have to say.
Any thoughts from the others?
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you again for inviting us for this important event, and I'd like to chime in what the Dr. Chen said, but also I want to empathize that the invisibility that we experience as an Asian community is clearly a product of a long-standing exclusion of Asian community, which is based on white supremacy and other racist policies and schemes that the earlier other people also mentioned. So I think the APIDA community or Asian Americans are conveniently chosen and used in anti-Black racism or other discriminatory logics, sometimes as a model minority and other times as a foreign threat. So as we all know that the racism is a very dynamic process that kind of endures and evolves over time. And it can be very apparent and explicit, or sometimes hidden and subtle. So racism is not operated in a very, the unique, kind of unified single manner. Rather, it is working in a various, very separate but interrelated ways. So because of the nature of the racism and white supremacy, we always see that there's some categorization and ranking and discrimination among the different kind of populations, and APIDA communities are sometimes conditionally accepted as white adjacent and situated in a very relatively kind of privileged position compared to Black community, but at the same time we're excluded and treated as a perpetual foreigner, and our experience are whitewashed and erased. So that combination, of such a kind of conditional acceptance or relative privilege and the exclusion from the society kind of created a very unique and kind of strange position for all of us. So this kind of allow us to, speak up a little bit about the racism, but also at the same time, not quite enough kind of space and power to address the long-standing invisibility issue. So I think that I just want to mention that these devastating impact of the anti-Asian racism through invisibility is something that sort of damaging the community so much, and we got used to it for so long time. So often we even downplay the pain that comes with this invisibility. So I thought that would be important to mention that that's very unique kind of the APIDA communities in this national the racial reckoning and where we are in terms of the invisibility and representation.
Thank you very much for your insights on the visibility, invisibility. It's a very tough dynamic. I wonder if other panelists have some insights they want to share about this issue?
I want to share with you an interesting descriptive study that was published in Boston Globe. So there was an online survey targeting about 2,700 Americans. And there were some questions about Asian Americans. And then this survey was done in the height of racial discrimination against Asian Americans. But shockingly, 25 to 40% of white, Latinx, Black Americans were unaware of the increase in assault and hate crimes against Asians. Another shocking thing that I find was that 1/4 of white Americans said they do not believe that anti-Asian racism is significant enough problems to be addressed. And when asked, have you ever heard about, or can you name aware known Asian Americans? And most common answer for these 2,700 participants were, I don't know. But the second most common answer was Jackie Chan. So the conclusion that I want to make is that there's so pervasive lack of understanding and misunderstanding of this population. And I think that's part of the reason why this perpetual foreigner syndrome and modern minority myth, all this kind of, very unhealthy narratives or images on Asian Americans are pervasive and continuing, and it's hurting us continuously. And right now we are living in 2022, and so many people have contributed and fighting for reduction of the racial discrimination. But where are we right now? And why are we going back to the past, like 200 years ago? And I think that's a really important question that we need to ask. And are we improving in terms of dealing with these issues, or are we going back? And why?
Thank you for sharing the data. I think data is very important so we could see more clearly these issues that we're talking about. Before I move on to some other questions, do the other two panelists want to chime in on this first question?
I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be a part of this panel and for this important discussion that we're having. With regards to considering issues of visibility and representation, one of the things that I consider relates to, or how I'm approaching this relates to my own social location and lived experience, and that of communities that I'm a part of and have worked with, and how those issues are made visible or invisible within scholarly research and policy agendas. So in terms of my current position at UCLA, I feel fortunate to be positioned both within social welfare and Asian American studies. And when I think about my trajectory to social work, it was born out of two things. First was my experience as a child of working class immigrants from the Philippines. And for myself, being born in the United States as a second generation Filipino American in a very diverse city of Long Beach, California. Given this positionality, I witnessed firsthand disparities in my own community early on that planted seeds for wanting to understand and support change in my community as well as other communities that were shaped by the migration experience. Another pivotal moment for me was studying ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, which grounded me within a historical context as well as a critical lens. Understanding frameworks for with regards to race and racialization, colonization, imperialism, that help to frame contemporary issues facing communities of color in the United States, including the ways in which Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are racialized. So when it comes to questions of visibility for me, it's always been rooted in a knowledge and a commitment to address the very real disparities facing Asian migrant communities in the United States that are part of the diaspora. And it's through that grounding in ethnic studies, recognizing that such diverse groups within our population are racialized and reduced as stereotypes, as model minorities, as perpetual foreigners, and the ways in which that also has masked the tremendous diversity within our population and the disparities we face. One other thing I wanted to make note of is just, with that, for many years, I've engaged in community-based participatory research with youth in the Cambodian community, where research has revealed that for, decades after resettlement, many who are part of that first generation continue to suffer from severe mental health disparities, including high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that brings me to the importance of disaggregation of data for Asian American and Pacific Islander groups, because those disparities often remain hidden when data is aggregated as a whole within our AAPI or APITA population. For too many years, the challenge was having not enough data, primarily quantitative data about our community, but for the last 20 years, with studies such as the National Latino and Asian American Study and many other studies since that have included disaggregata, we're learning more about our communities. But it's frustrating to hear, according to an off-cited, for example, a 2019 JAMA article, that research focusing on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities constituted just 0.1% of the total NIH budget between the years 1992 and 2018. And over that 25, 26-year period, there was not much of an increase in funding. So despite the work of scholars who've laid the groundwork for scholarship focusing on our communities, we still encounter a number of structural barriers, such as lack of funding, that work to hinder scholarly progress in addressing disparities in our populations.
Thank you very much. And I appreciated your personal story to make it real that we're not just, statistics are important, but we're not just statistics, that we all have our unique lives and situations and stories. So thank you for that perspective. I'd like to move on.
Could I pick up on one point here?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, this is Gautam Yadama from Boston College. Thank you for being patient, and giving each of us our perspectives. I'd like to note and we can pick this up as we go forward as a panel, 2 points that our fellow panelists have brought up very wonderfully. The points about visibility, invisibility, and lack of understanding, and this last point about disaggregation of data, which is key to getting towards pathways of understanding the Asian American experience as divergent. Because I think underneath that, the reasoning for disaggregation is to tease out the varied experiences under this uber term called Asian American, which in itself is a problematic phrase because, in my younger days, we used to call West Asia as Turkey and so on. That language has disappeared, but we're all lumped under Asian American in the US. So I think we need to pay great attention to this, how disaggregation of data actually helps us collectively coalesce as Asian Americans to become more visible even as we identify the varied and divergent experiences in America today. So I think this is part of the tension, is we're dealing with a framing that is very broad of this population, but how do you collectively act based on the disaggregation of studies? And maybe we can pursue this a bit more later.
Thank you. This is a nice transition to my next question. I also want to thank the technicians for putting the screen here because my neck was starting to fall off. So the next question, and it's more of on this critical line, and the question is to the panelists: how might we shift conversations about victimization to more critical conversations that account for white supremacy, structural violence, and interlocking systems of dominance based on race, class, gender, immigrant status, and other dimensions? And if you let me, Dr. Yadama, could you respond to that? You're on a roll.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to speak to a little bit of historical alliance around work that our Black brothers and sisters have done around civil rights and anti-Black racism. If you go back to the 1900s, there was a very vibrant conversation between the Black intellectuals, Du Bois and others, and Mahatma Gandhi, who was leading the anti-colonial, anti-English independence movement. And there's a beautiful series of, letters written between Gandhi and Black intellectuals that looked up to the Indian independence movement and Gandhi's nonviolent movement as a framework and a model for fighting racism. And I start there because I think part of this moving away from victimization has to do with finding alliances today in America for, Asian Americans with our Black and Latinx communities and championing our cause with, when I say our cause, I'm talking about the cause of Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latinx, Americans. And I think that's a very powerful, perhaps, opening for us to think about. And I don't see that happen. And this is a lament I have. And I think part of moving away from victimization would be this collective action with others.
Thank you. Very insightful. In one sense, why reinvent the wheel when we have the history and shoulders to stand on that have gone and done wonderful things before us. So thank you. Others want to voice your opinion on that?
If I can comment for a moment, thank you so much, Dean Yadama, for that starting point in terms of looking back to history. As I mentioned earlier, I have a rootedness in ethnic studies that has informed my path within social work. And I feel like both fields have twin commitments to social justice and are rooted in social justice values. And with that, I also feel very grounded within a socio-historical context of diverse populations in the US, having learned histories of solidarity and common struggles across racialized groups in the United States. Though those struggles have been distinct, there have also been numerous parallels in these long histories of violence and systems of inequality that we're embedded in. So I think it is important for us to learn those interconnected histories. And just to reference an earlier point too on the term Asian American and how even the acronyms we use can be, sort of diverse, contested in many ways. But with regards to Asian Americans specifically, before it was a demographic category, it was really that term was born out of political struggle, out of necessity, out of the movements of civil rights and discrimination of the 1960s and 1970s. And it was Asian Americans who were protesting then that were inspired by Black civil rights and Black power movements of the time. I've also written with other colleagues about the history of ethnic studies and how it can inform an understanding within social work, how it was a parallel movement that was multiracial, transnational, and anti-racist and anti-colonial. And so we can call upon this history to understand that we also have done this before. There are those connections. We have a foundation, and we must look to our current conditions to move forward. But we do have those histories to remind us that we're not alone in the struggle.
Thank you.
I would like to chime in. I think in order for us to address what you said, moving from victimization to more critical conversation, I think we have to name the racism. What that means is that we need to make it visible. So, I really like Senator Elizabeth Warren talked about. She said, we cannot fix what we can see, okay? And this racism against Asians or BIPOC, but we're talking about the Asians, right? It is so pervasive, but it is so vicious, and it is affecting us every day, and it has been affecting our health, our children's health, and our grandchildren's health. But it's so insidious because sometimes we cannot really see it. Sometimes you cannot really see because it's not really visible sometimes, and make us really feel confused that maybe we are too sensitive. Okay, and it is. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in NIH, which Cindy pointed out. We talk about health disparity issues all the time. And NIH, now they're trying to act like they're now thinking more about or trying to invest more money in ethnic minority population. But Asian Americans are always the last in the line to be invested in, to be cared for. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So first, I'm going to repeat what Cindy said. Only 0.17% funding from NIH was allocated toward clinical research on AAPI communities for the last 27 years. 0.17%. That is close to 0%. It's not even 1%. You know what that means? That means we are not worthy of having good health. We're not worthy of raising our children in a socially, academically, physically well and healthy individuals. That's what they are saying. Second statistic is that AAPI investigators were 74% less likely than white investigators to be funded for NSF, National Science Foundation grants in social science. So that means no matter how hard we work, we are going to be beaten. We're going to be beat. We are not going to get funding. No matter how hard we work, no matter how much we sacrifice our time and our blood. That's what it means. Number 3, only 5% of funds were distributed to research training awards and fellowships for AAPI. Okay, for the last 27 or 8 years. So that means our fellows, the people that we are training, they may not be able to climb well in the academia. That also means we are not going to generate the data that we need to change our policy, to change this status quo. The status quo that we are dealing with is unacceptable. And you just talked about it, that this Asian American woman was killed this morning. I mean, this is so outrageous. Why are we tolerating that? Why are we tolerating this? Why are we still quiet and be silent? This is a wake-up call for us. And I really thank you for having this conversation, creating this conversation. And we really needed to have this representation and this spotlight so that more SSWR members will pay attention to this conversation. And we have not had enough opportunities to do so. And it is overdue.
Thank you. Other thoughts before we move to the next question? Your passion's coming through loud and clear over Zoom. Just a note for those here in the hall room is that we will have time for questions at the end. So hopefully you're writing those down for yourselves or remembering them. Okay, the next question in this.
Sorry, Peter, if it's okay, I'd like to chime in just really briefly. So I just want to thank Dr. Howe for bringing up the issue around funding, because without really a reliable source of support, it's very hard for us to really kind of build through the ranks so that we can have people who can really support one another. The thought I did have, I just wanted to share around having critical conversations, is that a lot of our understanding of these collective histories really comes from, as kind of Cindy mentioned, also the Asian American movement, which started in the 1960s, which was in solidarity with the civil rights movement, and this has really benefited. In terms of legal protections and immigration reforms for Asian American communities. But there's also an opportunity for us to consider ideologies of dominance and structural racism in post-colonialism as an outgrowth of the exploitation of people of color across the globe. The seminal work, Black Power, which was first published in 1967 by Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton, really kind of advocated for this idea of the Third World Coalition as a coalition that comes from the unity of African Americans with Asians and other Latinx movements. And this should be free from the pre-existing order. I say that because, right now, I think the point is still relevant 50 years later, right? As long as we still continue to frame our identities against a backdrop of whiteness, then Asian American APIDA communities were reacting and caught flat-footed instead of creating and co-constructing our identities as Asian Americans within our own communities, but also in partnership with those who want to have these critical conversations. So I just wanted to say that because maybe that's also a way for us to think about where we can start.
Thank you. Should we move on? Just a little quick summary is that, we started on that question about reminding us about the history, but I think we also heard along the way that we need to make our own history based on, true, authentic visibility. So thank you. All right, so the third question on this first question is how might we address these issues while building bridges with other BIPOC communities, which refers to Black and Indigenous people of color? And I'll leave that question for anybody to start. It's kind of like Jeopardy.
I think we've picked that theme already, because Keith just made the point, so did Cindy, and I kind of alluded to that. So the question now is, we have to ask ourselves, in the academe, where are the conversations happening between Black, Indigenous, and faculty of color across the spectrum? And how is that actually getting operationalized, both in our research and writing? Because I think, while I said collective action is needed, it has to be rooted in our daily, doings and beings. And that's where it flourishes. This work has to be rooted. And since we're talking about SWR, I think part of what we have to do as faculty is work across these seeming silos. I want to open that up for my fellow panelists to see if they have ideas as well.
Thank you, Dean Yamada. I think that as a APETA community member, I think that we have a lot of things to even think about our own, reflect on our own sort of kind of the even racism within us. I think that we are victimized and targeted of the racism, but also at the same time, we are not so completely free from the hierarchy of racism as well. So I think it would take some unlearning and relearning to understand the structural racism that the country has experienced. And I think the entire BIPOC community and also the globally, actually not only in the US, have some complex history of unique social positioning and oppression and also the resistance. So I think the understanding that complexity history is the first step. I mean, I'm actually talking to myself, as a relatively new immigrant to this country, I still have a lot of things to learn, and I know that is maybe the case for some of our colleagues as well. And I think the kind of critically analyzing that the structure, racism, and inequality that the country experienced, and that kind of interrogation of the problem takes some a massive kind of work, but I think that that's the first step, and it's important for us as an ally. I mean, we actually need to build this kind of the collaborative organizing and coalition and alliance to see the world in a way not only just our own lens, but also how and why different perspectives can be brought up in this conversation by other BIPOC community members as well. And of course, this process, involves some bias and, of course, some prejudice and kind of difficult conversations. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that, that kind of the limited understanding that we have first, and then try to mitigate that gap through constant conversation and collaboration. And as some of you mentioned earlier, like 1960s when the Civil civil rights movement, the Asian community was part of that, but also at the same time, there was a, sort of imposed kind of the label of a minority, model minority kind of myth, spread in the country as well. So kind of we are not completely sort of the innocent from some of the, the racial, conversations in the country as well. So I think the acknowledging that is, and having difficult conversation, I think it takes some courage, but I think that is maybe the first step to build this coalition and collaboration.
I would like to chime in a little bit. So when I was looking this question, I was kind of thinking about, the concept of racism. What is racism? And why is it maintaining? And why is it everywhere? It exists in everywhere. And I feel like racism is driven by and maintained by very strong human emotions and human desires. That could be hate, those are hate, and greed, and ignorance. And I was also thinking about, then what's the opposite of hate? Opposite of hate is very simple. We know it's love. And I wanted to connect the love with the book that I'm still reading it. It's by Scott Peck, it's called Road Less Traveled. It's an incredible book. And it says, love is action. Love is activity. Love is not feeling. Okay. So I was thinking about, collaboration or working with other BIPOC communities. What do I do if love is action? Okay. What am I doing? Okay. Another quote is this: the more you know, the more you love. Okay. I feel like we don't really know each other. Even among Asian Americans, we are so divided. I'm a Korean American. I grew up in South Korea, in Seoul, for 23 years. Okay. Do I know so much of other Asian Americans? Their histories, their upbringing, or their trauma that they have experienced, intergenerational trauma? Well, I have a lot of things to learn. Do I know about Black population? Their history, terrible history. Latinx. Have I spoken to Latinx faculties, or did I go to them and, talk about like collaboration, like intense collaboration, not just superficial saying hi or what did you do last weekend? No, I think we have power to change the world, but we forget about that. I think we are passive. We're just passively waiting for Messiah to come and change the world. Messiah meaning a big leader. But I think we can be the big leader. And the society changes by really moving the needles, right? By little, but it's each individual's action and our activity, what we do. So by the definition, I think we are all guilty. I know I'm guilty. But then knowledge is our savior. And conversation and exchanging information, this is exactly what we are doing, is our savior. And by doing so, we learn. And we need to increase our motivation to learn and love them, love us. Without that action, I don't think anything is going to change.
Thank you. Just a little humor here. I don't know if it's safe to talk about love at SWR, because you can't measure that, but...
You can measure it by what I said, activity.
Okay, so other comments on this point? I have two
Can
more
I-
questions. Yes, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add, and Dr. Hom, thank you so much for those comments, and to everyone. I'm just really feeling sort of the spirit of the Zoom room, and I really appreciate this conversation. I've been reflecting too on Dean Yadama's call to have us think about alliances and collective action. And I think because of my work focused on migrant communities, I think about conversations around or discourse around immigrants and the ways in which in this country, folks are often primed to think about the Latinx, Latina population, as well as Asian Americans, but the ways in which there are parallels as well as divergences within our own population of Asian American Pacific Islanders, as well as across other diasporic populations in terms of thinking about, forced migration, which has been occurring, within Asia, within Latin America, within Africa, with so many places around the world, as well as how many migrants are brought here to the United States and have encountered or experienced exploitation due to racial capitalism. And so these broader themes could be applied across diverse populations, but then are also important lenses for understanding distinctions, again, within our own racialized populations. It's oft cited too that Asian Americans have been one of the fastest growing racial groups in the United States for a number of years. We've also got to remember that our population is, if we're talking about Asian American Pacific Islanders as a whole, we also are characterized by vast disparities in income and socioeconomic status, in addition to the other dimensions and axes of difference and identity with regards to migration, and processes of racialization and incorporation as people of color in the United States. And so I also think about those dimensions with regards to the class diversity and diversity, again, in terms of other dimensions, and embracing an intersectional lens, looking within our community with regards to, gender and sexual diversity, religious diversity, immigrant status, again, because a large proportion, I think about 15% or so of Asian American Pacific Islanders are undocumented. So taking into account the diversity within, and then also being able to see those parallels across communities can help to make some of those connections too across communities.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so this is the second question. It's a little shorter, but we're shifting from a broader conversation and all these insights that we had, and I'd like to focus more inward, meaning us and the academy. And so here's the second question. And this is more of an intro, Asian Pacific Islander and Apadi represent a conglomeration of many diverse groups based on ethnicity, culture, nationality, language, religion, as we just heard, socioeconomic positions, and migration status in the United States. Within the broader APIDA umbrella, many groups such as South Asians and Southeast Asians, Muslims, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, Arabs, international students, undocumented APIDAs, for instance, have been underrepresented or marginalized. In addition, the historical erasure and broader experiences of violence among these diverse groups may work to exacerbate current anti-Asian racism. And of course, the tragedy we heard about in the subways of New York this morning. So here's the question, and this is again kind of pointing at us. As social workers, how can we be more conscious of this diversity among students, with colleagues, in our work and research, and how can we be more inclusive in our research and training of the next generation of social work practitioners, educators, and scholars. So this is kind of like the rubber hitting the road. So panelists, thoughts, wisdom.
If it's okay, I'd like to start because there's a lot of things that are going through my mind as I'm also listening and reflecting on many of the things that Cindy, Chris, Yadama, which you're mentioning around creating career pathways so that people can in fact move through the ranks, education amongst our own communities, and also in the academy, advocacy across different levels, but also the creation of affinity groups. But you know, there's also a thought that I've had about how we can better understand diversity. Within our populations, Asian American, APIDA, the diversity is really a strength. And so there's definitely not been enough to examine how we can disaggregate ethnicities in research, but also in our conversations about violence and anti-Asian racism. So as a social worker and researcher who applies the social determinants of health framework to understanding a topic that I looked at for, I guess, some years now of acculturation, what I've come to understand is that ethnicity is less biological, and instead it's a proxy for structural inequalities in the context of post-colonialism, immigration, and racism. So disaggregating according to ethnicity and researching and acknowledging cultural differences is a very important first step. But in order to do the real work of social work, of achieving inclusivity, I think we have to dig much deeper into what these structural inequities actually really mean and where do they come from. So just to kind of talk about a study that I've been doing recently that I published in Social Work and Public Health, I was looking at Chinese older adults in the context of how many of them immigrated as blue-collar workers before the 1990s and worked most of their lives in a lot of really rather hazardous professions, such as factory work and restaurant work. And that's an important part, important aspect to understand. If we only looked at Chinese ethnicity, we would not be able to capture the consequences of this cumulative disadvantage in this population. So this is just one example, but I think there are also a lot of other things that we need to look at, which would bring greater inclusivity, as well as understanding for us to advocate for an Asian American APIDA-centered agenda in our work and in our populations and also in our communities.
Well, that's one example, but it really opens up a lot of deeper questions. So thank you for that. Others on what can social workers do?
I think identification or identifying the mechanism by which structural racism operates is going to be critical. So what that means is that we need to ask a question. You know, when you look at the phenomena, when you look at the structure operations, how is racism operating here? What can we do to change this mechanism? I think that is really critical. So, you know, for us to raise the next generation social work researchers, we cannot just say, you have to work hard. You know, of course, everybody's working hard, right? But when we are working in a system or in an environment or in a climate where racism is pervasive, then that makes us really in a disadvantaged position. So this social climate is like the water that we are swimming in, right? And that water can be very toxic water, and the water can be very healthy water. What happens to the fishes who lives in the toxic water? They're gonna die slowly, right? But what happens to the fish who lives in a healthy water? They can be flourishing. They're gonna have a lot of babies, and they're gonna flourish. It's exactly what it is. So I think we have to really think about the social climate that we are living in and social climate that we individual is creating in. So me, which is individual, but then where are we? How are we living? So constantly asking that question is going to be very important. So the second one is to generate the social work researchers, okay? I think NIH or NSF or a lot of this government, not only just government, just foundation, these reviewers, oftentimes they are not Asians, right? And again, which I talked about before, there's a lot of misunderstanding and lack of understanding of Asian American research and Asian American researchers. So I'll give you a couple of examples, which I've been thinking about that for a long time. So number one, whenever I submit my research grants or I talk to other Asian American researchers who are very, very smart, working so hard, but unsuccessful in receiving grants. Okay, the common themes that we collect is this. Number one, there's a huge invalidation or lack of appreciation of our research. Okay, so for example, your study is not going to be representative or generalizable because it's such a small population. Well, really, it's not a small population, so it's ignorant because we are the fastest growing population, right? It's exploding. Our population is exploding, but well, does anybody know about that? Not really. And then number two is different expectations. Whenever we study Asian Americans, the reviewers are expecting us even higher, or they're demanding higher rigor of the study. Okay, higher rigor of the study, we can do that. But with the money the budgeted money is there, right? And we have to design our study, which is going to be meeting the budgets. But then they have different expectations. Another thing is, there is something called the Oppression Olympics. Okay, so our proposal is about Asian American studies, but they are still better than Latinx. Okay, they're healthier than Latinx, or they're healthier than African Americans. So it's not worthy of your study. They don't say that it's not worthy, but that's basically saying. Okay, so these are the themes that is happening. And these are the things that we are experiencing over and over again. So my proposal is this. I think we need to have a committee, or we need to propose some kind of task force. Task force needs to be formed to provide advices for NIH or NSF or just funding, government funding sources, because without having a really clear understanding of our oppression and what our lived experiences and our population, we are going to continue to suffer. So I think investing our time in those kind of advocacy work is going to be critical, and then also linked to the tenure and promotion processes. I think that tenure and promotion committees need to really understand the value of advocacy work, because our job is really defined as publication, publishing or perish or bringing money, right? A lot of times. Of course, teaching is also important. But in Research One University, those first two are really, really critical. I think we need to rethink about this advocacy, because the long-term health really depends on our advocacy work.
Thank you. Very concrete steps for change. More thoughts?
Well, I'd like to pick up on one point from my vantage point. How can we engage in research and training in the next generation? And I think part of this has to fall on the current deans of schools of social work, and myself included. We have a lot of programs for training Black postdocs or Asian postdocs and so on. But perhaps we need to begin engaging in programs, whether in the summers or during, during the year, where we actually bring our Black and Latinx scholars with Asian American scholars, particularly disentangling, and moving away from this moniker Asian American to East Asian to South Asian, because there is, all my fellow panelists have already made this case very nicely, that our lived experiences are varied. And perhaps bringing a representation of Asian Americans with the representation of Black and Latinx scholars, those who are both in doctoral programs, but also who've recently become postdocs, for both exploration of cross-cutting areas of research that we could be pursuing, and for fundamentally discussing sort of the epistemologies that we are coming from in the way we approach our research, and how do we undo some of those epistemologies. I think, talking about collective action, which I did previously at one level, is fine, but this is the level at which it has to begin to happen.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Okay. I'm going to take a little risk here. Only the moderator, but as the power is invested in me as a moderator, I'd like to appoint all of you deans of research in your respective schools. So take that back to your schools. Okay, our final question is also focusing on us as social workers. And at this point, we don't have a seventh inning stretch, but I'd like you to keep in mind that we will have time for Q&A from the audience. So here's the final question for the panelists. And again, it has a little intro. Interpersonal microaggressions, harassment, and on-the-job discrimination in hiring, firing, and promotion experienced by APIDA members are often affected by stereotypes, prejudice, and the model minority myth. Yet these experiences have been largely silent, maybe until now. So here's the question. How do we start talking about these critical issues, especially hiring, tenure, and promotion practices in social work academia? Thoughts from the panelists? Dr. M, I see thoughts coming out of your mind.
Well, again, I don't want to be sort of dominating the discussion here, but since the hiring, tenure, promotion practices have come up here, I'm feeling compelled to say a bit here. I think Hyojin mentioned something that really picks up very directly, that how do we examine our own biases and prejudices? We're not free from that. I think there was a very good point she made. And I'm starting there because my fellow panelists are already leading in their respective areas, and one day they will be leading a department, a school. They'll become provosts and presidents. And so I think when we are given that opportunity as an Asian American, our first obligation must be to live what we're discussing here. that is, really examine our own biases in not only ensuring that our schools and departments, our institutions, at whatever level, are reflecting what America is today and our very different lived experiences, and everyone is getting a platform, genuinely, not platform because everyone's taking turns to have a platform. Rather, when we are, for instance, the way I think about all of this is, I am converged with my colleagues at my institution, but my lived experience and how I got here is very different than someone else's. And if I'm not leveraging as a dean their lived experience, then my institution is not robust, because it is not embedding the sensibilities and those life experiences to inoculate my chair, my department, school, whatever institutional setting is, against the turbulence of the world. And I think that's part of the responsibility. Even if one is Asian American, it has to be equally to everyone in the school, along with Asian Americans. Now here I will tell you two things. In my 30 years of experience, 30 plus years of experience in the academic world, and all of it in the United States, I have seen a change where, as an Asian American, if there is someone in a leadership position who's also Asian American, I've always felt very compelled to maintain my distance, lest others think that I'm leveraging some secret access to do well in that organization. But I think that is sometimes overdone, I feel. And leaders today have to be equanimous, but at the same time also not disadvantage those colleagues, whether Asian American, Black, or Latinx, if there is, if we belong to the same group. I think it's very important to think through these and play a very important role in setting an example in advancing the careers of all equally, but at the same time, right-sizing the inequities.
Thank you for that touching transparency. Others? I know you've got thoughts.
I'll say for a moment, as an not yet tenured member of this panel, a number of thoughts are floating through my head. But and thank you again, Dean Yadama, for those comments. It's really kind of encouraging and heartening to hear in terms of your reflections about these broader structural issues. I have to say, for most of my career trajectory, I've been fortunate to be in touch with mentors who understood the value of my work and had a context for communities that I'm a part of, that I've worked with, that are centered in my research. And their support has really helped propel me forward and sustain me in this academic journey. And I also think about the importance of, building community. I'm really delighted to be with you all here. And for those in person, I know you're here too. And I try to be intentional about sort of widening the net, broadening our networks, intentionally supporting one another and lifting up each other's work in this process. And so that's just one strategy that I've tried to employ.
So we're coming to a close because of our time. I'd like to maybe have, if there's one more panelist that'd like to respond, and then give time to our audience members if they have any questions. So one last thought, if it's out there.
I can share one last thought.
Oh, please.
So I was promoted to a full professor last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so I was the first Asian American first Asian American professor, actually, was promoted to full professor at Boston University, history. So, I mean, that's exciting, but there's also, I feel like it's kind of sad, So that's the fact. But then I just wanted to share with you, my thought process was. So I studied as assistant professor, right? Like us. And then I moved up to associate and move up to full. And each time, whenever I was trying to go up, or each day when I was working, and when I'm working now, I always try to think about or ask this one question. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you doing what you're doing? Am I doing this to get tenure? Or am I doing this because this is so important for me and for this world, for this community? And I think as we get promoted, as we become tenure, we sometimes lose this question. Sometimes lose this, the passion. Oh, it's now you have tenure. Everybody tells me, why are you working like an assistant professor? Oh, why can't I? The question is really interesting, right? So as if you get tenure, then you don't have to work anymore. I mean, that's a really bizarre kind of comment. But I think we need to really ask and examine that comment. And really ask to yourself, why are you doing what you're doing? I think that is going to be always refreshing and put you in to set you up in a really beginners and very humble position of really trying to pursue the social changes and pursue the equities. Why? Because we want to live healthy. We want to live like whole human being. And we want to accept other people as their the entire potential. We want to treat other people with the individual with an infinite potential. I think that's the ultimate role and ultimate goal of social work. And I think we should remember that.
Thank you for that reminder about, why we're here and what we should be doing as far as helping our fellow humans. I want to thank the panelists, but before we formally thank them, is to turn the room over to you. Anybody here would like to ask a question to our panelists? And we have microphones that you can go to. And when you do that, just say your name and what institution you represent. And we'll start over here on my right side.
I'm Xinyang Guo, professor at the Brown School.
Can you guys hear? The panelists, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Professor from Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you, our great panelists, and thank you for your leadership, Dr. Peter Szto and Dr. Arati Maleku. Indeed, you offered very insightful opinions and shared with us the very informative opinion about the work we should do to fight racism, particularly for Asian Americans. From this conference, up to this session, just before this session, we saw the importance of fighting racism, and we always heard the problem with African Americans. The day before yesterday, we had the opening plenary, 3 wonderful panelists talking about Project 1619 from a historical perspective. And this afternoon, just prior to this session, we heard from the annual policy forum. And we heard the experts talking about reparation. And all these were about African Americans. But it is just from this session we know how serious the problem exists in the racism, anti-Asian Americans. And your opinion, your insightful discussions are so helpful. The experiences you shared with us, the opinions, perspectives you shared with us, fit to the theme of this conference so well. So really, thank you very much for your wonderful contribution to this conference. I have a very specific question for you. What are things we can do, or what are most important things we can do or we should do that go beyond advocacy? Thinking about research, what kind of research? Well, we're doing social work research. We are thinking about evidence-based practice or evidence-driven research. What kind of evidence we can produce, particularly fighting racism to protect the Asian Americans? Things like, what are the most important things? Should we develop a specific instrument to measure racism, anti-Asian Americans? Should we do interventions? Or should we collect additional data to measure segregation, particularly related to Asian Americans?
Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
So we have a few people that I want to all get to. So maybe one panelist, could you respond to this unique question?
Could I say to my friend, Shenyan Guo, thank you so much for that question. Good to see you. I think there's one project we should undertake, which is really, if we can empirically document the varied experiences of the populations with health systems, social welfare systems, and other systems of Asian Americans that are lumped together, but disentangle that in some very systematic, methodical way, it would give us, I think, a pathway into further questions that we might do comparative studies around or pursue individually around particular populations. I think that's one larger Uber sort of project that I don't think has been tackled yet.
Thank you. On the left, name and institution. Should be on.
Sorry. Hello? Okay.
Here you go.
Michael Lewis, Silverman with Keith. We're colleagues. I have a question about...
Oh, you could take off your mask,
yeah,
I think.
All right. I have a question about this idea of, I guess, coalition building across race, specifically blacks and Asians, to use that problematic term. First, I agree that ought to happen, but I think we should be clear on I think, some real tensions. And one of the speakers, I think, noticed some of this, I think. I mean, I don't know all the names, but one person sort of highlighted this. I think there may be some real tensions between these two groups. I'm from New York, so I know New York best. But as I understand it, a lot of the, or actually maybe not a lot, but a fair amount of the violence against Asians during the pandemic, as I understand it, was committed by blacks, as I understand it. And then also in New York, but also San Francisco too, there have been some tensions between these two communities around education, specialized school admissions, things like that. Some high-profile affirmative action cases that have created tension. So there are some real tensions there, and in the effort to create some kind of cross-racial coalition building, we should be aware of that and think about ways to try to address that. So my question is, given that reality, what might be, I was an organizer one time. I do policy, and I was an organizer, so this is how I think. So what might be a very concrete project that might be the place to build some kind of cross-racial advocacy mobilizing, given the very real tensions, I think, that are there?
Yeah, that's a great question about model building or something that's effective. Someone want to respond to that?
So I'd like to actually say a little bit, and then maybe some other colleagues can also add something. But I think that I really appreciate you bringing up the tension that we always try to sort of kind of close our eyes to and walk away. But I think that's there. But I think we might want to look at the bigger structure of this system, the racism, racial schemes. I think that under the broader umbrella of white supremacy, anti-racism and anti-blackness, I think that those are just the different forms, just taking different logics of racism. So we should not really just think that racism should have a one face and one manner. So, I mean, of course, you understand this very well, but I think when we look at only the focusing on the anti-Black, anti-Asian, kind of that sort of the small pockets. Of course, these are not small, but just the segregated kind of way. I think what we miss is this is just a single umbrella of the racism that we face in the society. So just coming back to your question, I think the project, I'm not sure, but I think the one thing that just comes up to my mind is we barely have a chance to just have open conversation, like a community conferencing, for example, like a very honest kind of conversations about the racism and the racial experiences in each community. I think that that kind of the things could be one first step, but before then, we might want to have a better language, better framework to see the issue, rather than see this as just the conflicts and tensions between the two minority groups. We don't want to just sort of kind of say which group has a more oppressed or the targeted by which group or something like that. But I just want to point that the biggest scheme is white supremacy, and the diverse variety of BIPOC communities are equally suffering under that scheme. So just want to mention that.
Thank you. We have two more questions. I'd like to hear them, and I'd like the panelists to answer them, but we're a little over time, but if we can just stay together for a little more deep conversation. And as they say, Asians, they're always late anyway, so what's the difference? Okay, question.
Hi, I'm Jessica Kim. I'm from the school.
Oh, you could take off your mask.
Oh. Hi, thank you. I'm Jessica Kim. I'm from the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I feel everything you talked about really resonated, especially the lack of funding. So Dr. Hom, thank you for your comments. I certainly struggle with that as a PhD student for a number of years now. I really appreciate this gentleman's question just now about the multiple tensions that exist. That was actually my question. I was going to point out the issue of policing, which seems to be a conflict of interest between the Asian American community, especially right now as we're advocating for increased safety and protection of our communities. But how do we do that? Advocate for greater safety and protection via a system that's also oppressing Black lives. So that's something that I constantly, this keeps me up at night and it stresses me out. So I appreciate that question, but you kind of spoke to it a little bit, so I'll go to my next question, which is, I'm from Penn, where the notorious Amy Wax is, and I'm just wondering how you all are thinking right now about how to respond to someone who is a tenured professor making these kinds of comments. I have really struggled over the last few years as a student to try to give her the benefit of the doubt when she's made inflammatory comments in the past, because at a university I value diversity of thought, and it's okay if someone is saying things that I totally disagree with. I think that's what stimulates debate, but it's getting very, very difficult and almost impossible to justify the things that are coming out of her mouth these days. And so I just want to know, for you all who are in academia, right, who are faculty members, I think you are maybe better positioned than I am as a student to respond to somebody like her. She's your colleague. So what is your response to Amy Wax?
If I could just clarify that question, for those who do not know what she said, could you describe to the audience or tell us what the professor said?
Everyone should just Google it for themselves, but basically she's just flat out saying there should be less Asians immigrating to this country.
Right,
And that's
okay.
the bottom line.
Good. Who would like to respond to that?
It's like, can I just say that?
Yes.
It goes back to, our conversation that Asian Americans, we are dealing with the two stereotypes or the conflicts. One is Māori minority, and the other one is a yellow peril. So yellow peril is based on the fact that Asians are invading U.S. Okay, we are the invaders. So basically, I think her position or her comments are deep rooted in the belief that we are not your neighbors, and yet we are your enemies. That's basically what it is. So I think it just goes back to, what we are saying right now. Just so much misunderstanding and lack of understanding of us, okay? And Asian American students, or any students in America, they never learn Asian American history, right? I have 3 children. They never learn Asian American history. I talk about it, but it's very limited, right? How much can I teach them unless they teach systematically at school? What's really amazing thing happened in Illinois and New Jersey is that now they passed a law, if I understand correctly, that there's going to be a mandatory education for Asian American history. And I think this is a critical, pivotal movement and victory, that we have a long way to fight, but one way that we can fight and bring the victory is educating people. We need to fight against ignorance.
Yeah, thank you. The history is important, and calling people out when they're wrong is also important. So thank you. The gentleman here, and then we'll have one more.
All right, so my name is Eric Tre. I am from Indiana University. Thank you all for all that you shared. Really great. Now, the question that I have relate to what the social work we do in the academy. I think talking about some of the things around the solidarity and all the need to focus on white supremacy, because it's the root of all of these issues and that piece. But one of the piece that I see from epistemological standpoint, I think I'm also seeing, because all of our institutions and everything are all structured on and around whiteness, we have also become so much a product of the very thing that we are trying to deal with. And sometimes it's like, it's difficult because, I mean, nobody will give you a tool to destroy itself. And so we see, even in our, studies here, I go across some of the posters and I see our studies are so much statistically driven, and statistics oftentimes decontextualize a lot of these issues, and we are thinking about the history pieces. And when I look at like somebody like Francis Galton, this guy was, how he came out with what we now consider so much about normal curve and other things, where you can normalize population, and in this case, white is the norm, and so how much of all the others are closer or deviate from this norm. And so as we are thinking about our profession, what we do, and then the collision building, but how do we reconcile that with the idea where we just find ourselves in one box? This is my area of research, this is that. And so how do we now bridge that across discipline as a way of building that solidarity, and then building epistemological stance that does not locate knowledge from the whiteness sense, but we can decenter whiteness in our research and in everything, so that we can have the kinds of the tools that we need to build the solidarity across knowledge, and then translate that into practice. How do we build that tool from our own academy?
Thank you for that question. Very articulate. And the answer is?
Could I pick up on this?
Yes.
May I? Thank you. This also relates to what the question I really loved was from, I think, Mr. Michael Lewis. Did I get the name right? Yeah. There was a few questions ago. Like, what can we do specifically? So let's turn to why we convene at SWR, which is to advance, or to Professor Shanye Guo's point, evidence-based research and evidenced interventions and so on. I think what we have an opportunity to refocus some research in social work that's fallen by the wayside, which is around community development, community organizing, what we broadly say lump under macro social work. And the reason why that's an area that is ripe for this conversation and ready is, in a lot of our urban centers, urban neighborhoods, or new populations, new immigrant populations, or whether it's Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston, New York, you name it. We have our Black communities living side by side, new immigrant communities. A lot of them are Asian immigrant communities, some of them from the African diaspora. I think we need to be thinking about interventions of joint and collective advocacy around issues that affect them broadly, because they're in contiguous geographic spaces where cities and the policies that cities are addressing or not addressing are certainly affecting them. Policing has come up in this. Is there a way for us to really methodically, systematically produce a set of current scholars and new doctoral students to take on this research, where we seed interventions, meaning, let's say that there are certain new models of collective movements that come from Latin America that could be seeded within a Peruvian community that is adjacent to a Black community, but then it spills over into a joint action. And how do we systematically first document those and study those and see if they have a very different effect on the quality and well-being of these communities writ large, not just one specific Peruvian or Black community, but together, all of them. I think this kind of work is probably needs some very careful attention within the field and a way for us to come together.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. We have one more question, so we saved the best for last. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you hello? Thank you so much for allowing me to ask my last question. So my name is Ling Fu. I'm the PhD student from University of Chicago. Thank you all so much for a wonderful and insightful panel discussion. I have personally learned so much from all of you. And also please allow me to just say hi to my former professor, Yadama, and also Dean Yadama, my former professor at WashU. So great to see you today. My question for our panelists today is about using the term of Asian American. Actually, using this term, to me at least, like kind of excluding undocumented like immigrants, refugees, as well as international students like me, who may also encounter the same level of racial discrimination in the US. So when anti-Asian violence and crime happened, those criminals did not ask about like your citizenship before they decided to commit crime or not. However, when we're doing policy advocacy, we're always using like the Asian Americans. It seems like we only advocate for equity and rights for those with citizenships. So from my understanding, like building solidarity does not only mean that unifying people from other racial groups, right, but also include like unifying people within our Asian groups. So I just wondering about our panelists, your insights on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the response is,
well, if nobody wants to chime in, maybe I can just chime in. I mean, it's a difficult question, and I think, but the terms are very important, and I don't have an answer for that. But I hear you because I also came to America as an international student at the age of 23. So I struggle with the term. And actually, my experience is that I identify myself as a Korean woman for a long time until about 5 years ago. I became Asian American woman, okay? So I think the racial identity issue is a developmental stage, individually speaking, but also it has a political connotation. And I think it's okay. So to make it really short, my term, I think we have to think about two opposite things. Number one is when we are collecting the data, we need to disaggregate the data. But when we are, politically, if we want to be powerful, I think we need to have a term. I don't know if Asian American is the best term or not, AAPI. I mean, there are different terms, right? We're going to have to use a term which collects, which unites all of us. Maybe create a new term, okay? But then when we are doing the study, we need to disaggregate. But when we are politically fighting for our own social equity or health equity or equity for the socioeconomic status, then we have to unite. And we need to think about the term. I think that's a really, really important, concept that you're bringing. I don't have an answer for that, but thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'd like to chime in for a second just around this question.
Real quick, because we're
sure.
People are looking at me.
So a few things I just want to point you to. The Pew Research Center actually did a whole study on looking at how Asian Americans identify, or people of Asian descent, whether they identify as Asian Americans, of their own ethnicity, and so on. And that's a very complicated. That's a very complicated issue that I think ultimately, I think it invites much more conversation. But one thing I do want to mention, and this is really just from Chris's comment around politics, is that if we want to make things happen, we need to have the votes. And this is a piece of wisdom I gained just from the past year working for Congress and understanding that if you want to make things happen, you need to have the votes. And when you bring people together as a coalition, it doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything. We just need to agree on enough to get the agenda moving forward. And so I think that's really the place that I believe we need to be right now, because we have a very short window right now to make things happen.
Thank you. So yes, get out to vote. I'd like for us to give a warm thank you to our panelists. So much wisdom, so much learning. And I also like to give a special thank to Dr. Maleku. Would you like to stand and we could recognize you? She doesn't know I'm going to say this, but she worked her tail off to really pull all this together. She really did. Up to the last minute. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the audience for staying a little longer. I'd like to just wrap up with a few closing thoughts. Not too long, just a few closing thoughts. One is, as you could tell, the conversation really is just beginning. And I hope that all of this has not only affected you intellectually, but touched your hearts, so that when you go to your respective communities, you make the change. You talk to your students, you talk to your colleagues about what you heard today here, and we could move this together. So I want to just leave it at that, and thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the conference.